At my celebration for the promotion, my parents raised a toast, saying, "Too bad you'll never outshine your sister's business." I chuckled it off, then casually mentioned, "Funny, because I just acquired her company." The room fell silent as they nearly choked on their drinks. The champagne had barely settled when my father clinked his glass with that exaggerated flourish he always used to grab attention. The restaurant buzzed with soft laughter and the sound of polished silverware against fine china. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to believe that perhaps, just perhaps, this time the evening wouldn't conclude with a backhanded insult disguised as humor. The venue was perfect, a cozy, softly lit bistro nestled on a quaint downtown street, complete with leather booths, exposed brick, and an atmosphere that made even awkward family gatherings feel somewhat tolerable. It was my promotion party, after all. My night, my moment. I had dedicated the last 2 years to working longer hours than anyone else in my department, juggling multiple responsibilities, cleaning up messes that weren't mine, and somehow managing to keep my team running smoother than corporate ever deserved. Finally, I had been promoted to regional director. Finally, my name was printed at the top of the internal newsletter. And finally, my mother had something she could boast about in the church bulletin. But my parents never allowed things to be about me for long. Dad stood at the end of the table, holding his glass like it was a royal scepter, and cleared his throat in that theatrical way that always signaled trouble. Everyone paused, turned, and smiled politely, while I braced myself instinctively, as if I were flinching before thunder after a lifetime of storms. "To Alex," he began, "and I'll give him this. He always started with the right words, hard-working, determined, loyal, just like his grandfather. We're proud of you, son. Truly." He gave me a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, and I nodded politely, already sensing the undertone coming like a ripple beneath still water. But then he added, "Too bad you'll never outshine your sister's business." There it was, the signature twist, the backhanded compliment with just enough venom to sting but not enough to call out in front of company. A few people laughed nervously, unsure if it was a joke, unsure if they were supposed to laugh at all. My mother let out that familiar sigh she used to diffuse tension, but then added, "Your father's right, dear. You've done well, but Emily has always had that special touch with business." Emily smirked, of course she always did. She didn't even look up from her plate, just smugly pushed a bite of steak around with her fork, as if she hadn't just been held up as the pinnacle of family success in a room meant to celebrate someone else. I could have swallowed the insult, I could have smiled tightly, made some comment about how proud I was of everyone's accomplishments, and let the evening dissolve into forced small talk. But I had spent too many years doing just that. I had bitten my tongue through years of being compared to Emily, the golden girl, the chosen one, the successful entrepreneur with a sleek car and a trophy husband. And now, as I sat there at the head of a table meant for me, hearing once again how I'd never be good enough, I felt something shift. So I smiled, not the kind of smile I'd learned to wear at board meetings or networking events, but the kind that comes when you finally decide to stop playing nice. "Funny," I said, lifting my glass slowly, making sure everyone could hear me, "because I just bought her company." It was like dropping a lit match into a room filled with gasoline. The air snapped. Emily's fork clattered to her plate, and her head jerked up so fast it was almost comical. My father choked on his whiskey, coughing so hard his face turned crimson. My mother froze, blinking as if she hadn't heard me correctly. The chatter around the table stopped completely, just dead silence, as if time itself took a breath to catch up with what I'd said. I didn't explain, I didn't elaborate, I didn't soften the blow. I simply took a sip of champagne and let the truth hang in the air like the scent of smoke before a fire, because it wasn't a joke. It wasn't a bluff. I had, in fact, acquired Emily's company, a struggling mess of a business that had once been the pride of every family conversation but had been quietly bleeding cash for nearly 2 years. I had acquired it anonymously through a holding group buried under enough legal layers that no one would suspect a thing, not until I chose to tell them, not until this exact moment. As I set my glass back down, I could feel every pair of eyes on me. But I didn't speech about how Emily was redefining entrepreneurship, how her new campaign had put her on the map, and how young people like her were the future of business. My mother tried to interject something about my recent promotion, but Dad waved it off with a laugh and said, "James is always doing fine, but Emily's really making waves." And just like that, I disappeared again. Have you ever sat at a family table and wondered why your success never counted the same as someone else's? Have you ever poured your heart into something only to have it dismissed as background noise while someone else was handed the spotlight for half the effort? I'd love to hear your stories because I'm starting to realize how many of us have been sidelined while smiling through the ache. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to know I'm not the only one who's ever felt like a supporting character in their own family story. It wasn't just Dad, either. My own mother, Elaine, was always gently complicit in her silence and occasional pointed remarks. She'd pat my hand and say things like, "You know how your father is. Don't let it bother you." Or, "Just let Emily have her moment. You've had yours." But when exactly had I ever had my moment? I couldn't remember a single time anyone in that family looked at me with the awe they reserved for her. Even when she was stumbling through failed ventures or repackaging mediocrity as brilliance, it didn't matter what I did. I wasn't flashy, I didn't throw big parties, I didn't charm with sound bites or photo ops. I just worked hard and kept my head down. And apparently, that didn't count. And yet it did, quietly, slowly, it counted. While they toasted to Emily's latest cars and press releases, I was building something real. I was learning systems, managing crises, hiring the right people, refining processes, climbing a ladder they didn't even know existed. But beneath every success, that bitterness kept simmering because the people who were supposed to be proud of me didn't even see me. That bitterness reached a new temperature the day I had lunch with an old client from years ago, someone who had shifted into venture capital and was now dabbling in small business turnarounds. We met to catch up, trade stories, maybe talk future deals, and then casually, over coffee, he said something that snapped my attention to full alert. "By the way," he said, stirring his drink, "isn't your sister Emily in charge of Landmark Media? Because I heard they're trying to offload some assets. Rumor is they're bleeding cash behind the scenes. Word is their debt-to-profit ratio is upside down. Sloppy expansion, bad marketing decisions, maybe even some internal conflict. You might want to stay away from that mess if anyone ever brings it up to you." I didn't respond immediately, I just nodded, played it cool, and filed that information somewhere deep in the sharpest part of my brain. Landmark Media, Emily's pride and joy, the Golden Girls' empire. And suddenly, I saw something I hadn't dared consider before, not just revenge, but opportunity. Because maybe the pedestal wasn't built as high as it looked. And maybe it was about time I climbed higher than they ever imagined. The thing about secrets is that they're rarely hidden in locked drawers or dark alleys. They're usually sitting right out in the open, just waiting for someone who knows how to look. After that conversation over lunch, I couldn't shake the thought that maybe everything I'd been fed about Emily's business, the slick brochures, the shallow interviews, the family worship disguised as admiration, was just a mirage. So I did what I've always done when something doesn't add up. I started digging quietly, carefully, the kind of research that doesn't show up in public search histories or dinner conversations. I knew better than to storm in with assumptions, so I approached it the way I approach everything, with methodical precision and a cool head. Even though my blood was pounding beneath the surface, it started with the basics. I pulled every public record I could find on Landmark Media, financial disclosures, business filings, press releases, even employee reviews on obscure job boards. Most people don't think those little breadcrumbs mean anything. But when you've spent enough time reading between the lines, patterns start to emerge. And what I saw in those patterns was a company dressed in its Sunday best, smiling for the cameras while the floorboards were rotting underneath. The numbers didn't lie. Profits had been declining steadily over the past 18 months. Operational costs were climbing without explanation. Employee turnover was absurdly high for a company that supposedly prided itself on its culture. There were whispers of unpaid invoices, disputes with vendors, and one particularly damning thread on a business forum that suggested Emily had burned bridges with two major clients over contract violations. I remember staring at the screen, late folded heart steady, waiting for the curtain to drop. As I closed my laptop that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, something heavier than excitement, deeper than pride. It was control, pure and sharp and powerful. And for once, it was mine, not given, not borrowed, not handed to me with a caveat or comparison attached. I didn't want applause, I didn't need it. But when the curtain finally lifted, I wanted them to know exactly who had been pulling the strings all along. There is something deliciously maddening about sitting across a dinner table from people who are blindly celebrating a lie, especially when you are the one quietly orchestrating the truth they'll never see coming until it's too late. I kept my face calm, my smile polite, my voice even, but inside I was practically vibrating with the weight of what I knew. It had been just over 6 weeks since Tom sent that initial letter of interest under the Redwood Equity name, and everything had moved faster than either of us had anticipated. Emily, drowning beneath a pile of debt she couldn't even fully articulate, responded with barely veiled enthusiasm, desperate to present herself as a savvy businesswoman seeking growth partners rather than what she really was, a sinking captain trying to sell a ship before anyone noticed the leaks. She hadn't asked many questions, which honestly surprised me. I thought she'd dig, maybe ask about the trust behind the acquisition firm or the real long-term intent behind Redwood Equity's interest. But Emily, for all her pomp and polished appearances, was still the same short-sighted opportunist I remembered from our childhood, quick to grab anything that sparkled without ever questioning the hand that offered it. The negotiations began quietly, held in conference rooms I never physically entered and over phone calls I never had to make. Tom handled everything with surgical precision, and each time he updated me, I felt like another piece of the puzzle had clicked into place. And still, I kept showing up to family dinners like nothing had changed. There I was last Sunday, seated between my mother and my sister's husband, politely passing mashed potatoes and pouring wine while my father launched into yet another long-winded monologue about Emily's supposed brilliance. "I'm telling you," he said, slapping the table with a meaty palm, "Emily's company is going to explode this year. She's expanding west, thinking national scale. Big things coming. Real legacy moves." My mother nodded along, her eyes shining with that same misplaced pride she always wore when talking about Emily, as if her accomplishments somehow justified every disappointment they had projected onto me for the last 20 years. I raised my glass and smiled, the corners of my mouth twitching slightly because all I could think about was the ink drying on the latest draft of the acquisition contract. I knew the truth they didn't. Emily's company wasn't expanding, it was dissolving. And within days, it would legally belong to me. Every new decision, every direction, every deal would run through my desk. I had every document reviewed, every clause scrutinized, every loophole sealed. This wasn't a partnership or a merger, it was a quiet takeover dressed in polite legal language and business-friendly semantics. And Emily, still oblivious, was bragging about new branding strategies and partnership opportunities like she wasn't signing away every ounce of her autonomy. She even joked over dinner about how the new investors were lucky to be working with her, about how they probably didn't realize what a steal they were getting. I chewed my food slowly, trying not to choke on the irony, imagining the look on her face the moment she saw my name on the final ownership paperwork once it passed through the final transfer process. What struck me most wasn't just how easy it was how disturbingly satisfying it felt. For years, I had been the one they overlooked, the one who stayed late and spoke softly, who didn't demand applause or attention but earned every win with grit and strategy. And now, I had outmaneuvered the very person they idolized without ever raising my voice or announcing my intentions. It was quiet power, clean power, the kind that doesn't come with fireworks but with contracts and signatures and unspoken authority. Still, beneath the satisfaction, there was an unfamiliar unease creeping in. I couldn't quite explain it, not even to myself. Maybe it was guilt, though I doubted that. I hadn't lied or stolen or manipulated, I had simply done what needed to be done. But maybe it was something else. Maybe it was the sharp realization that no amount of power would ever really fix what had already been broken in this family. They would still see Emily as the golden girl, still toast her imaginary triumphs, still pretend that her downfall was a fluke instead of a reckoning. But I would know. I would always know. And that, strangely, didn't bring the full peace I thought it would. The final documents were signed on a rainy Tuesday morning. I sat in my home office, dressed in my usual understated work clothes, clearly reveling in the spotlight that she hadn't even earned. She moved through the room like it belonged to her, air-kissing cheeks, telling jokes, dropping hints about upcoming deals she had no business bragging about. Still completely unaware that she'd already sold her crown without knowing who had claimed it. I watched her from across the room, my champagne glass in hand, wondering if she'd ever guess what I'd done before the night was over. I wondered if she'd even believe it when she heard it from my lips. Then, just as I expected, my father stood up with his usual dramatic flair, holding his drink high and calling for the room's attention like some self-appointed master of ceremonies. My mother stood beside him, nodding and beaming with practiced pride. The clinking of his glass was almost comical in its predictability, and the room fell silent with a mix of anticipation and awkward familiarity, everyone bracing themselves for whatever tone-deaf monologue he was about to deliver. To Alex, he began, his voice loud and performative, drawing out the syllables like he was narrating a holiday movie. Our hard-working boy, climbing his way up step by step, always doing things the long, honest way. A few scattered claps echoed around the room, and I nodded politely, my face frozen in a smile that didn't reach my eyes. But he continued, pausing with a grin that told me exactly what was coming next. Too bad you'll never outshine your sister's business. He chuckled at his own joke, glancing around as if waiting for others to join in, completely unaware that he had just stepped directly into the trap he didn't even know existed. My mother added, with what she probably thought was kindness, but we're still very proud of you in your own way. It was quiet for a moment, the kind of silence that wraps itself around a room and presses against the walls like a thick fog. And then I raised my glass, tilted my head slightly, and let the words fall from my lips with the same calm precision I'd used to dismantle an entire company behind the scenes. Funny, I said, not raising my voice but speaking just loudly enough that no one could mistake what I was saying, because I just bought her company. There was a beat of stunned silence before the entire room shifted. My father sputtered mid-sip, coughing violently into his drink as a few guests turned sharply in their seats. My mother's champagne glass slipped slightly in her hand, spilling onto the white tablecloth. Emily's face went pale, then flushed a deep blotchy red, her jaw tightening as she looked at me like I'd just slapped her across the face in front of everyone. The whispers started immediately, low murmurs exchanged, glances, confusion rippling through the crowd like a slow-moving wave. I didn't say anything more, I didn't need to. The sentence had done everything I intended it to do. It wasn't just about humiliating her, although I'd be lying if I said it didn't feel like justice. It was about reclaiming the space I had been denied for so long, the seat at the table they'd always said wasn't mine, the respect they had always withheld no matter how many battles I fought or victories I earned. Emily didn't speak. She couldn't. Her mouth opened, then closed, but no words came out. She glanced toward her husband, then toward her drink, then finally toward our parents, whose expressions had soured into something between disbelief and rage. My mother sat rigidly, hands folded in her lap, eyes locked on her plate, as if pretending not to see would somehow undo what had just happened. The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. How many years had they spent singing her praises, worshipping her supposed genius, propping her up as the shining example of success while ignoring everything I was quietly building in the background? And now, without so much as raising my voice, I had knocked their golden girl off her pedestal with a single sentence. Still, as the shock settled in, the air grew heavier, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel at all: doubt. Not about the decision, not about the business, but about the part of me that had waited so long for this moment. Was this strength, or was it pettiness? Had I made a point, or had I simply drawn blood for the satisfaction of watching it spill? I excused myself before dessert, telling everyone I had an early meeting in the morning, which was true but also a convenient excuse to leave the tension-filled room I'd set ablaze. As I stepped out into the cool night air, shoes clicking against the pavement, I let the silence wash over me. It should have felt like victory, and maybe it did. But underneath the satisfaction was a whisper I couldn't shake, one that asked if power ever really fills the void where love was supposed.